This is Eric Blair from the Blairing Out with Eric Blair show, and I'm here today at the iconic bookstore Book Soup on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood. And I have the pleasure of talking with Jim Morrison's close friend, Frank Lisiandro, who is here doing a book signing for his new book, Jim Morrison, Friends Gathered Together. It's a series of conversations that you had with dozens of Jim's friends and members of the Doors family. Why didn't you include any of the Doors themselves, Ray, Robbie, or John?
Not to give offense to Ray, Robbie, and John, but they had their platforms to speak to the public about themselves and Jim Morrison. My feeling was, let's hear from the people who interacted with him on a daily basis, who were his friends, his co-workers, his lovers, his mentors. Let's see what they have to say in contrast to, or in confirmation of, what the three surviving Doors had to say. And then people would have more evidence to base their portrayal of Jim Morrison on. I asked them to tell me, in their own words, from their own experiences, what they saw as eyewitness participants, what Jim Morrison was like. Don't give me any urban rumors, I said. Don't tell me stuff that you heard from someone else. Tell me about the Jim Morrison you knew.
Tell me about how you came upon this treasure of these floppy disks and these tapes of these recordings that you did back in '90.
I don't throw things out very easily, and especially when there's stuff that has to do with projects I've done in the past. So I had done these interviews, put them in storage somewhere with film materials of films I had worked on. And one Saturday morning, I was looking for something else, and I'm tearing through boxes, opened this box, and I said, what is this? Floppy disks. Fortunately, I knew how to label things, so I could read the label, and it said Feast of Friends Interviews. That was the name of the book I produced, Jim Morrison, A Feast of Friends. I said, oh, that's interesting, and I picked up some of the transcripts from those interviews and started reading them. Well, I spent the entire day reading the interviews. They were so compelling, and I didn't remember them. Well, it's 20 years before. But 20 years later, I'd read the interviews and realized that they were compelling, they were important, they were an oral history of Jim Morrison, the Doors, the music of the times and the place in which all of that happened. And I thought, this has to be presented.
It seems that Jim actually had a small circle of close friends, not a large entourage of hangers-on like so many celebrities seem to have. Would you agree with that?
Usually he hung with the people he was doing work with. So when we were making Highway, the film Highway, or the film Feast of Friends, it was the three or four of us who were working on the film together. Of course, Jim had other friends. I don't want people to get the idea that the people in the book are his only friends. And there's one of his friends calling right now.
In the book, Sherry mentions that Pamela did have an entourage. Is that true?
I didn't know Pamela well enough because she didn't want to be known well by Jim's other friends. She wanted an exclusive hold on Jim, it seemed to me, and she deserved it. She's a very quiet and self-possessed person, so I have nothing really to say about her. She seemed to be supportive of the part of Jim that he needed support for, and that was his poetry, and I respect her for that. It's a really romantic story. Two young kids meeting on the Sunset Strip. They lived in the Love generation, and they lived on Love Street.
In reading your new book, I got a much different view of who Jim Morrison was as a person. I'm now questioning what I should believe about Jim.
What I tell people about Jim Morrison is if you want to know the guy, really know the guy, read his poetry. Read what he wrote. I mean, he left us hundreds of pages of writings, and much of it is autobiographical. If you want to know the man through the eyes of his friends, read Morrison, Friends Gathered Together. That's a very complicated question, Eric, and you phrase it in a way that demands a thorough answer, because I think there are depths and levels to the question of what Jim Morrison would have been like if he would have survived the 27 catastrophe age. And I don't know what he would have been. I have a feeling that he had worked through, lived through, being a rock icon, and was ready to explore other forms of expression, other forms of artistic expression. So I think he wanted to see the fruition of his poetry. He wanted to be a filmmaker. He wanted to write and direct films.
You first met Jim when you were both film students at UCLA. So when you knew Jim before the Doors were even formed and you were close friends up until the day he died, did you see any real differences in who Jim was before the fame and after the fame?
The major difference that I can talk about was his self-confidence. There were a lot of people who had a lot more personality being expressed during those UCLA days, and Jim wasn't that way. I mean, one hardly heard from him in class. Later, after he had been on stage for a while and developed a great singing voice and become who he was, there was a self-confidence in meeting with the press, in being on stage, in virtually all aspects, meeting with fans on the street. But he still retained among us, when he was just with us, that humility, that quietness, that shyness. I guess that's the word I look for. He was shy at UCLA. He was shy and quiet, and he still retained a lot of that later on. But then there was this new self-confidence